Okay, thanks so much. Assalamu alaikum. Well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. It's my great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Marion Katz. So Professor Katz is a professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University, where she has been a member of the faculty since 2002. She's one of the leading scholars of pre-modern Islamic law, with works that brings together legal theory, history, ethics, gender, ritual practice, and lived social meanings of religious norms. Her scholarship has shaped the field through remarkable body of books that she produced in the last few years, such as Body of Text, The Emergence of the Sunni Law of Ritual Purity, The Birth of the Prophet Muhammad, Devotional Piety in Sunni Islam, Prayer in Islamic Thought and Practice, Women in the Mosque, A History of Legal Thought and Social Practice, and finally, Wives and Work, Islamic Law and Ethics Before Modernity. Across these works, Professor Katz has shown how Islamic legal thought cannot be understood only as doctrine, but must be also read through practice, devotion, ethics, social life, and the ways communities negotiated authority over time. So we're very excited to have Professor Katz with us here at ISAM. It's such a pleasure to have you again to come to Istanbul. And without further ado, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the generous invitation. I'd like to thank Professor Murtaza Badir and also Professor Sami Ayyub for making it possible for me to visit, and thank you for coming. So I'm going to be talking a bit about my book project in progress, and I'd like to start with an example of the material I'm working with. So in Damascus in 634 of the Hijri calendar, or 1237 of the Common Era, the wealthy merchant and Hanbali jurist Uthman ibn al-Munajjah established a waqf comprising a wide array of urban and agricultural property. The bulk of the proceeds were designated to benefit his existing and future children, but a portion was assigned to, quote, the poor, fuqara, who have memorized God's glorious book or part of it and understand it, who recite the glorious Quran at the tomb of the aforementioned founder on the slope of Qasyun, and give the merit of that to the founder, his parents, and all believers. This waqf is already well known. The text was published by Salah ad-Din al-Mudanjid in 1949, and the merit donation provision was mentioned by Daniela Talmanheller in her 2007 study, Islamic Piety in Medieval Syria. What I'd like to do today is to put this transaction within the larger context of historical concepts of thawab, which I'm going to translate here as merit, and the things that people did with it. So, as mentioned, Talmanheller does at least briefly reference the donation of merit at several points in her book. As of yet, however, no one, and here I'm looking primarily at the English language literature, but I will definitely be interested if I tried to look a little at Turkish, although my Turkish is very poor, and at other languages. But so as yet, as far as I've been able to determine, no one has really analyzed when and how the concept of merit as a transferable good developed, what social and political work such donations were doing, or how the practice was debated on a normative level. The objective of my project is to juxtapose the evolving fiqh discussion of this topic with an account of the associated practices constructed from literary, epigraphic, and documentary evidence. The latter evidence is not new, but often has been interpreted in ways that sidestep the issue of merit donation and thus exclude any analysis of its development and function. So, thawab, reward, and specifically divine reward in the afterlife, is a ubiquitous concept in pre-modern Islamic discourses, one encountered in works of theology and law, as well as in those dealing directly with judgment in the afterlife. Nevertheless, thawab has remained near invisible in the secondary Islamic studies literature. There is, as far as I can tell, essentially no English language secondary literature focusing specifically on the development of conceptions of thawab in pre-modern Islamic thought and practice. To the extent that it has been discussed, it's in ethnologies of contemporary Muslim communities, such as the anthropologist Emanuel Schäublin's Divine Money, Islam, Zakat, and Giving in Palestine, which came out in 2023. The most obvious reason for this omission is that the concept of thawab has been assumed to be both transparent and consistent, requiring no analysis and producing no history. The larger project from which this talk is drawn argues that the concept of thawab was in fact subject to development and debate, and that as a result it does have a history. In particular, I'm looking at the historical practices and debates surrounding the question of the transferability of thawab. Can a person take the thawab resulting from his or her pious action and donate it to another person? In recent decades, Islamic studies in the English-speaking academy has taken what's referred to as an ethical turn, initiated by figures including Talal Asad and Babar Johansson, and including such scholars as the late Saba Mahmoud, Hussein Ali Agrama, Amira Mittermeier, and Mariam Shebani. Within this trend, the most influential strand is represented by anthropologists, including Asad, Mahmoud, and Agrama, whose analysis centers on Islamic virtue ethics. In this framework, the focus is on the cultivation of a pious and virtuous self. This approach has been enormously productive for Islamic studies in the English-speaking academy, helping to transform the study of Islamic ethics from a niche concern of area specialists into a set of theoretical discussions that have attracted attention far beyond the immediate field. However, this focus on the cultivation of the pious self has become so reflexive that it sometimes obscures other elements of the Islamic ethical tradition. The accumulation and transfer of thawab represents an element of Islamic ethics that has so far been neglected in the literature. Nevertheless, the accumulation of thawab is quite a different model for thinking about what it is to be a good person or to live a good life. Muslim scholars who supported the gifting of thawab directly challenged the idea that the bounded individual was the sole focus of Islamic ethics and proposed a non-individualistic ethic focused on interdependence and care. So in this talk, I'd like to briefly discuss three topics. First, the historical emergence of thawab and thawab transfer as topics debated by Muslim legal scholars. Second, the thawab donation practices that flourished specifically under Ayyubid rule. And third, the significance of thawab donation as an element of Islamic ethics as discussed specifically by scholars working under the Ayyubids. So, what does it mean to say that the concept of thawab has a history? Hasn't it been present from the dawn of Islam? Well, I would say yes and no. Of course, the idea of otherworldly rewards for the good actions of believers is as old as Islam. The Quran pervasively references these rewards, sometimes in vivid terms. For instance, chapter 18, verses 30 to 31, showing an English translation on the screen, affirms that those who believe in good deeds will have gardens of lasting bliss, graced with flowing streams. There they will be adorned with bracelets of gold. There they will be comfortably seated on soft chairs. What a blessed reward, thawab. There are also obviously numerous hadith referencing otherworldly rewards, including some that suggest a quantitative dimension. In the example shown on the slide, a pious slave is promised a double reward, ajran, implicitly for maintaining faith and virtue under circumstances of subjugation. However, I would argue that while the later juristic concept of thawab is fully compatible with such revelational proof texts, in other words, I don't have an argument here about what the Quran truly says, right? It represents some notable conceptual developments. Thawab, in what I'll call its classical form, was not envisioned primarily in terms of heavenly garments or other benefits that a person would receive in the eschatological future. For instance, when Uthman ibn al-Munajjah prescribed that the reciters at his tomb should donate the thawab resulting from their recitation to specific beneficiaries, I don't think he was envisioning that they should wait until the resurrection, hope to be granted paradise and then deliver heavenly golden bracelets or other concrete rewards to the designated beneficiaries of the waqf. Rather, people who engaged in such transactions and the scholars who theorized them envisioned thawab in terms of credits accruing to an actor in real time. Furthermore, thawab as merit was implicitly envisioned as neutral units that could be accumulated quantitatively rather than in terms of the diverse and concrete otherworldly benefits vividly described in many scriptural texts. The person who appears to have been most instrumental in explicitly articulating this classical concept of thawab was the Hanbali jurist Abu Ya'la ibn al-Farra, who died in 458 or 1066. His preserved arguments vigorously support the idea that thawab is an entity distinct from the acts of worship that generate it. He draws a clear and explicit distinction between doing an act of worship by proxy on behalf of another person, for instance, doing a hajj in order to fulfill the obligation of a person who is dead or disabled, and transferring the merit of an act, such as prayer, that can't be done by proxy. And he responds to objections that merit transfer impermissibly allows one person to benefit from another's actions. The arguments transmitted from Abu Ya'la imply that these ideas were far from obvious in his time. Indeed, we do not find these issues explicitly addressed in early fiqh texts, and merit donation is absent from early discussions of waqf. So earning merit for oneself from sadaqah jariyah is definitely there, but transferring merit isn't. What is, to my knowledge, the first treatise supporting the efficacy of giving merit, or ihda thawab, was produced in the generation following Ibn Abi Ya'la. Although this never became a major genre, there would be about 15 more treatises on this topic by the end of the Mamluk period, whereas as far as I can tell, 0 were produced in the first 4.5 centuries of the Islamic era. So, Syria and Al Jazeera in the Ayyubid period, that is roughly the late 12th through the mid-13th centuries of the Common Era, or the second half of the 6th to the mid-7th century of the Hijra, are a time and a place where we can observe significant developments relating to merit donation on both the material and the discursive levels. The most important venue for the generation and donation of merit in this period, as we've already seen in the opening example, was the personal or family tomb where the Quran was recited on behalf of the dead. It has long been recognized, particularly by historians of Islamic architecture, that this period is a historical context that saw an unprecedented boom in the construction of elaborate tombs for a wide range of members of the military and civilian elites. Scholars including Ernst Herzfeld, Yasser Taba'a, Daniela Talmanheller, and Toru Miura have written about this phenomenon from different angles. They've also noted in passing the widespread use of awqaf to support Quranic recitation at these tombs, although as far as I can tell, no one systematically looked into that. Indeed, my research shows that awqaf for Ayyubid royal tombs routinely included provisions for the support of teams of paid Quranic reciters. However, to the best of my knowledge, no one's tried to reconstruct what might have changed, either in terms of legal doctrine or in terms of understandings of the life in the grave, to drive this shift in architectural patronage. Here I'd like to briefly discuss a distinction that I think is not always clearly drawn. There's been quite a bit of discussion in work such as Christopher Taylor's In the Vicinity of the Righteous of tombs commemorating holy figures, including members of the Prophet's family and Sufi saints, and the devotional practices centering on that kind of tombs. In this project, I'm actually interested not in the sacred dead from whom people sought blessing and intercession, but the more ordinary dead for whom people sought to provide blessings and intercession. Although I can't go into this in depth here, I'd argue that there was a long-term development in which Sunni Muslims increasingly understood the dead in their graves prior to the resurrection as being radically dependent on the ongoing care of the living. Proponents of merit donation envisioned it less as a question of ensuring a positive balance for the deceased on the day of resurrection than of furnishing a comfortable post-mortem existence in real time. Gifts of merit were sometimes represented, particularly in dream narratives, as being delivered to the dead in their graves in the form of food and clothing, with the idea that you should do it on a daily basis. Of course, there was no absolute dichotomy between the dead from whom people sought help and the dead to whom they sought to provide help, but I don't think that the phenomena are really identical. Okay. So, Quranic recitation at tombs, while looming unusually large in this period, was not the only mechanism by which merit was generated for the sake of someone else. Another mechanism for the bestowal of thawab is attested in a remarkable cache comprising thousands of discarded documents, including about 150 scrolls documenting pilgrimages that was preserved in a chamber of the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus. The collection of documents was transferred to Istanbul in 1893 following a bad fire in the mosque in Damascus and has been exhaustively studied by Dominique Sourdel and Janine Sourdel-Tomin starting in the 1980s. There may also be Turkish language studies of this. The fragment shown on this slide begins with a witness statement identifying As-Sadr al-Imam al-Ajal Sheikh al-Shuyukh Izzuddin Malik al-Tariqa Abdulaziz al-Qushayri, and stating that when al-Qushayri arrived in Mecca, he prayed for al-Malik al-Alim al-Adil al-Kabir al-Mu'ayyid al-Mansur Salahuddin ibn Ayyub, a familiar name, right? A'azzallah ansarahu. Then he wanted to bestow on him a splendid gift from the noble sanctuary. He could not think of anything more magnificent than an umrah that he would perform for him. Sourdel and Sourdel-Tomin, the fragment then begins to recount the donor's performance of the pilgrimage before being cut off. Okay, this is a fragmentary document. Sourdel and Sourdel-Tomin interpret this and the many parallel documents in terms of the juristic doctrine that it is valid to perform the obligatory Hajj by proxy on behalf of a believer who is either dead or permanently disabled. In their view, the language characterizing these pilgrimages as gifts, remember, he was in the noble places, he wanted to give a gift, he couldn't think of anything better than an umrah. They argue that this language of gifting is basically a euphemism disguising transactions of proxy pilgrimage for pay. I personally think that these assumptions are faulty. Firstly, the pilgrimages in question are overwhelmingly supererogatory umrahs, right? They're not fulfilling the obligation. Secondly, Muslim jurists who accepted the legitimacy of proxy pilgrimage for pay, particularly those of the Shafi'i school supported by Salahuddin, were not squeamish about articulating such transactions very clearly in the relevant contracts. Finally, there are a lot of certificates documenting actual proxy pilgrimages in this same collection, and they have unambiguous features identifying them as proxy pilgrimages. So for all of these reasons, I don't see any reason not to take seriously the self-representation that this is a gift, right? Although this particular example is fragmentary, we can be confident of how it ended because of the relative uniformity of the language across the set of documents. So if you look carefully at the image of the slide, you can see, and this is not something I am noticing now, but these are fill-in-the-blank documents, right? With the names of the donor and the beneficiary filled in by another hand than the person who wrote the original form. So while there's some variation in the language, these documents always end with an affirmation by the pilgrim followed by witness signatures. This affirmation varies slightly, but it always states something along the lines of the merit of this, the pilgrim bears witness that, quote, the merit of this minor pilgrimage belongs to the aforementioned, أن ثواب هذه العمرة للمقدم ذكره, that he gave the merit of the minor pilgrimage to the aforementioned جعل لي, or that the merit of this blessed umrah is a gift, it's a hadiyah, right? So we can't be sure of the exact wording, like which version of the form the gift to Salah ad-Din used, but we can be pretty sure that it expressed the idea of gifting thawab, right, of transferring it to the beneficiary. Surdel and Surdel Tomin point out that the recipients of the pilgrimages memorialized in this cache of documents are overwhelmingly members of the Damascene military elite. I believe that we should place these gifts in the context of the patron-client relationships that structured contemporary political life. Gift giving is known to have been an integral part of the cultivation of these relationships in the Seljuk and post-Seljuk periods. And I believe in this period too, merit was used as a medium of political gifting. The degree to which the donations documented in the pilgrimage certificates were bound up with ideals of political clientage is underlined by the use of the terminology of khidma, or service. A number of the examples state the donor wished to serve the recipient, yakhdimahu bi, the gift of an umrah. And this is pretty loaded language in the context of contemporary terminology. So I will say that there's no direct relationship between the occurrence of this specific language of khidma and the existence of a formal patronage relationship between the individuals involved. In other words, you can find cases of that, like of a freedman doing it for his manumitter. But you wouldn't expect such a clear correlation because these are pre-written fill-in-the-blank forms, right? So the terminology is not that customized, right? So in this case, nobody like the Surdel and Surdel Tomin did a lot of research trying to identify the pilgrims and the recipients in these documents. No one has been able to identify the specific guy who is doing the Umrah for Salah ad-Din, but I think you can figure out some of the context. So the title Sheikh al-Shuyukh was bestowed on the heads of the Sufi lodges founded by Salah ad-Din in Jerusalem and Cairo. And a Sufi connection is also suggested by the title Malak al-Tariqa. So Emil Homerin and Nathan Hofer have both discussed how Salah ad-Din tied his patronage of Sufis to their reciprocation in the form of Quranic recitation and petitionary prayer, or dua. And so I think we can sort of add this thawab accruing from this pilgrimage to the forms of reciprocation that were happening between Salah ad-Din and people of Sufi affiliation. So that and the gifting at tombs are examples of the concrete instances of merit donation that I'm looking at for this period. One of the main objectives of this project is to make the doctrinal history of thawab donation speak to the socio-political history of the practice. As mentioned earlier, this is also the era and region where we suddenly see a modest uptick in scholars producing short treatises directly addressing the question of whether merit can be transferred from one person to another, and particularly to the dead. We also see the issue of thawab donation addressed explicitly in some detail in general works of fiqh, which is pretty new in this period. This development raises the question of which scholars interested themselves in this topic and what might have motivated them to do so. One factor driving the rising prominence of the issue of thawab donation seems to have been the efforts of Hanbalis, who promoted it in an Ayyubid context of inter-madhab competition and polemic. Although the Ayyubid family as a group famously promoted the Shafi'i school, their favor and patronage were not monolithic. For instance, Al-Malik al-Mu'azzam Isa, who died in 624 or 1227 and who had a tomb with reciters, embraced Hanafism unusually, but also commissioned a thematic reordering of the Musnad of Ibn Hanbal, which is sort of an example of how patronage of different schools wasn't monolithic. We can get some sense of the religious and political context in which Hanbali scholars promoted the doctrine of merit donation from the earliest fully preserved treatise on the subject, produced by a somewhat obscure Hanbali jurist and preacher known as Ibn al-Barni in Mosul, sometime between 597 and 607 AH. The work's introduction explains the event that inspired the author to write it. So, and the translation of the beginning is up there. He encountered an emir when riding on the outskirts of the city, and the two fell into conversation. The emir took the opportunity of this encounter with a locally prominent scholar to inquire about the interpretation of chapter 53, verse 39 of the Quran, which states that what can be translated as a person possesses only his own efforts. So, لَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. And so according to Ibn al-Barni, the emir said, so if we now give alms, recite the Quran, and make a gift of it to our family members and friends who are dead, that doesn't reach them and the barakah doesn't accrue to them, right? So Ibn al-Barni says he started explaining it to the emir, but unfortunately they got to the city gates and he didn't have time to finish, so he had the idea that he would write this treatise and gift it to the emir, right? And the treatise that he produced reflects the issue's general role as a topic of intermadhab disputation. Its central section is structured as a work of legal dialectic, or jadal, with separate sections on the proofs, or adilla, and rebuttals, or i'tiradat, available to each side of the debate. It's a if they say, we say kind of structure. This display of erudition was perhaps intended more to impress the emir than to answer his rather elementary question. However, it also seems to have addressed a genuine interest in the viability of merit donation on the part of a member of the military elite, exactly the people who are in this period investing in perpetual Quranic recitation at their family tombs. The idea that the transferability of thawab was an issue of concern for members of the military elite is reinforced by the introduction of another epistle on the topic from the end of our period, produced by Abdullah ibn Mahmud ibn Mawdud al-Mawsili, as his name suggests, another denizen of Mosul, who died at an advanced age in 683. He writes, one day, One day I was with a group of emirs and ulama performing the funeral prayer for a distinguished man. One of the emirs who was present said, this dead man was my comrade, sahibi. I want to recite from the Quran and donate, it's implicitly the merit, to him. Then he asked one of the jurists who was present, and this is probably a Shafi'i based on the response, does the merit of recitation reach people in their graves? He replied that the merit does not reach them. There was not, and now this is al-Mawsili, there was not enough time for me to debate him and give a response, so I wrote this treatise and gifted it to him, in other words, to the emir, so that he could rely on it and the correct doctrine would become clear to him. Here again, we see that the gifting of merit was a fit topic for a scholarly gift to an emir. Once again, the emir's concern is quite concrete. He wants to know whether merit donation to deceased friends is efficacious. Following the arguments of Michael Chamberlain, we should perhaps take this unnamed military man's statement that the deceased was his sahib as reflecting something more than personal affection. In both military and religious contexts, suhbah could designate a bond of affiliation and obligation, demanding gestures of loyalty and service, and the donation of merit would certainly fit into this context. In other words, we know about students donating merit to their deceased teachers and freedmen, to their manumitters and stuff, so potentially that would fit. Ibn Mawdud was a Hanafi, and his production of a treatise supporting merit donation around the end of Ayyubid rule illustrates another trend of this period, that of non-Hanbali jurists newly embracing the validity of merit donation. This development included Shafi'is who, ever since Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, had interpreted their school's founders' statements as denying the transferability of merit. So even like people who are direct school students of Shirazi, who like there's one particular figure who his claim to fame was teaching the Muhadhab in Syria, he's still like completely, he says this teacher is totally wrong on this, merit donation is totally a thing. So you can definitely see a trend there. In the Ayyubid period, some Shafi'is, notably Izzuddin ibn Abdussalam, continued to steadfastly reject merit donation, while others, notably Ibn Abi Asrun, who I was just mentioning, enthusiastically embraced it. Significantly, this trend seems most salient among scholars who are closely allied with the dynasty. Thus, Ibn Abd as-Salam famously maintained his independence from the ruling house, while Ibn Abi Asrun has been described by Mariam Shaybani as a permanent member of Nur ad-Din's entourage. I do not mean to suggest that scholars operating under the Ayyubids simply professed an extraneous doctrine for personal or political gain. We can see the same development around the same time, although at much lesser intensity, in regions far removed from the Ayyubids, where their dynastic positions would have been irrelevant. But what does seem to be the case is that the conversation on this topic was particularly extensive and lively within the Ayyubid domains and among scholars closely affiliated with the dynasty. Okay. So what kinds of arguments did scholars of this period make for and against the validity of the Thawab donation? On one level, of course, and I'm not going to go into this deeply, it was a debate over textual interpretation. Most centrally, deniers of merit donation cited the Quranic verse that troubled Ibn al-Barni's Amir, chapter 93, verse 49, which suggests that a person benefits only from his or her own efforts. On its face, this statement suggests a principle of ethical individualism, dictating that no person can be rewarded for another's achievement. Over the centuries, Quranic commentators had offered a number of different interpretations that circumvented that implication. Indeed, Ibn al-Barni's mentor as a preacher, or wa'az, the Hanbali exegete and preacher Ibn al-Jawzi, collected a set of 8 different interpretations denying that implication that became staples of epistles in support of the Thawab donation. The most radical of these interpretations categorically rejected the idea that an individual's moral agency was limited to actions that he or she personally performed. In the words of Ibn al-Barni, a person is rewarded only for his own efforts, but by virtue of his kind companionship, his aid to the believers, his marriage and siring of children, his desire to do favors to people and be friendly to them, his association with brothers in faith, and his formation of friendships in the religion, people invoke mercy on him after his death and gift acts of worship to him. All of those benefits are the results of his efforts, and therefore included in the mas'a of the verse. Ibn al-Barni moves on to discuss intercession, shafa'ah, as another textually established and widely accepted example in which the dead are understood to benefit from the efforts of the living, again negating a broad interpretation of verse 53-39. It's stated in the hadith, every believer possesses intercession. It's stated in another hadith, a person among the people of paradise will remember his friend who is among the people of hell, intercede for him and request him from God Most High. God will say, bring out his friend for him, and he will be brought out for his friend and brought into paradise. If the intercession of friends is effective in bringing people out of hell into paradise, it is not impossible that it is effective in delivering merit to them when they are imprisoned in their graves. By befriending them in religion and aiding them for the sake of God, the deceased have earned them as allies, and they possess them just as they have earned their children because they have expended effort to secure their goodwill. Deniers of the validity of merit donation also argued that acts of piety were specifically designed for the ethical improvement of the individuals who performed them. Thus, it would defeat the purpose for a person simply to receive the merit as a gift from somebody else. Ibn al-Barni expresses his opponent's objection as follows. They also argued on the basis that legal obligation, taklif, is a trial, a test, and a means of reform for those who are obligated. None of this is subject to being done by proxy. That is like the case of a sick person who needs to have a vein bled or to take a medicine that will mend his body, and someone else comes in as a substitute or proxy for him. The constitution of the sick person will not be mended by that. Similarly, religion's reform applies to each individual in particular. If another person comes in as a substitute or a proxy for him, this will not be effective in reforming him. Ibn al-Barni does not appear to offer a direct response to this argument, but Ibn Mawdud al-Mawsili responds as follows. Testing requires commandments and obligations. That is not relevant to the question at hand because we are discussing a person's gifting of the merit of his action to someone else. That falls into the category of favors and acts of beneficence, bab al-ihsan wal-mabarrat, not the category of commandments and obligations. Furthermore, in most cases, that is done on behalf of the dead, and dead people are not subject to commands or tests. To command or test a dead person would be repugnant, given his practical and legal incapacity. Al-Mawsili's questioner links this obligation with the related concern that merit donation poses a moral hazard. That leads to inaction. It is not permissible for a person to rely on others to do good works and donate their merit to him. In other words, like, if people can outsource their good works, why would they really work hard on it during their lives? Al-Mawsili retorts, we say that it would lead to such reliance if it were possible to be absolutely certain, in other words, that someone else would donate merit. But a person cannot be certain of it because it depends on the acts of an autonomous agent and is equally likely to occur or not to occur. In other words, no sane person would forego acting on his own behalf in favor of relying on the uncertain efforts of others. Furthermore, Al-Mawsili continues, this argument can be turned against the opponents of merit donation. Someone who doubts that merit can reach the dead will lose an important motivation to ensure the education of his children, particularly in the recitation of the Quran, leading to deleterious consequences, fasad. A final objection was that if merit donation was valid, logically, quote, it should also be possible for someone else's repentance or his excuses and apologies for his wrongdoing to expiate the sins of a dead person, just as the merit of another person's actions reaches him and becomes his when he gifts it to him. In other words, like, if someone else can get the good of our good deeds, why can't we make up for the bad of their bad deeds, right? Ibn al-Barni responds that on the level of custom and of rational reflection, this is true. We all know that in this world, we don't forgive one person for offending us just because somebody else apologizes. However, on the level of the divine law, ash-shar', quote, we see that God Most High has made it efficacious for Muslims to ask forgiveness from God on each other's behalf and for children to ask forgiveness for their parents. If some legally responsible actors perform duties such as funeral prayers and the commanding of right and prohibition of wrong, it obviates the punishment and fulfills the obligation for all the other people who refrain from performing that duty. In other words, Ibn al-Barni understands Shari'i ethics to be sharply divergent from the everyday intuitive ethics of our life in this world, specifically in the sense that the ethics of God in the afterlife are not strictly individualistic. The Sharia, he says, is full of instances where one person's action benefits another person who has done nothing to earn an enhanced reward. Both the divine mandate to ask forgiveness for the dead and the existence of communal obligations, or fard kifaya, that can be discharged by one party on behalf of the group are examples of this fact, in his view. So, depending on one's own doctrinal commitments, thawab donation and the associated practices, such as retaining reciters to serve at tombs, may or may not appear as Islamically legitimate or desirable. This is a normative question, and my purpose here is not to promote any particular form of piety. Rather, I see the historical debate over merit donation as a neglected facet of the history of Islamic ethics. Here I'm inspired by works such as Amira Mittermeier's brilliant 2019 anthropological study, Giving to God, which argues that traditional forms of Islamic pious giving offer thought-provoking alternatives to modern liberal frameworks of charity. Like Mittermeier, I believe that these historical Islamic ideas and practices offer valuable alternative to some taken-for-granted elements of modern Western ethics. On the level of Islamic thought, scholars like Ibn al-Barni, who supported the validity of thawab donation, vigorously promoted a view of Islamic ethics in which individual virtue and ethical achievement were complemented by interdependency and care. Rather than exclusively cultivating a pious self or working out one's own salvation, they envisioned that an ideal Muslim would cultivate relationships of kinship and faith through the care of the dead and the exchange of non-material gifts. Rather than working purely for his or her own positive afterlife, proponents of merit donation envisioned the ideal believer as striving to live in such a way that loving friends, relatives, and community members would be moved in turn to contribute their own merit after an individual's death. I'm certainly not suggesting that a focus on the accumulation and transfer of merit should replace the existing academic emphasis on the cultivation of a pious self as the focus of Islamic ethics. The maximization of merit can certainly serve as one focus of the Islamically good life. For instance, Ibn al-Batani's teacher, Ibn al-Jawzi, clearly believed that time was merit and structured his days accordingly. However, not even the most enthusiastic promoters of merit donation understood it as the primary means of ensuring a good faith after death. Nevertheless, I do believe that their non-individualistic perspectives on merit offer a useful supplement to the existing academic discussion of the history of Islamic ethics. In a contemporary world where the quest for individual self-improvement can sometimes compete with the communal good, it is helpful to consider a vision where gifts of merit serve to reinforce ties of kinship, friendship, and faith. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Professor Katz. Okay, going to open the for questions or comments. Welcome. Yes.
Thank you for giving this speech.
Speak up, please.
I want to ask you, do you think to include the current side of this topic in your project? Because this issue is still alive today, and people still praying on behalf of the deceased and also donating money on behalf of that.
So on the one hand, I would be extremely interested in any references or materials that you know of, if I could talk to you later. But I don't think that I'm going to go to the contemporary period just for two reasons. One is I want to be contextualizing the arguments that are happening, and I just, I feel as if anthropologists and contemporary historians are doing such rich work in specific contemporary contexts that they can do it better than I can with my training. But the other thing is, I don't want it to be a super long book. So, I want to go through sort of three phases. I think that there's a whole new conversation that happens under the Mamluks. One of the things that happens is the plague really changes the conversation. There's sort of a new urgency to the question of what one can do for the dead that emerges. So I think I'm going to get to the 15th century, okay. But not the present. Thank you.
Thank you for this fascinating subject. Giving us examples about non-material ways of gifting and the virtue ethics. This is fantastic. I'm interested, to see what you think about the background prompting this kind of discussion among the fuqaha, because the discussion strikes me as something that is really pushing the boundaries of legal epistemology. So that, I am therefore interested in what you're going to be saying about the discussion about the Shafa'ah, discussion about the Sufis at the time, and therefore, trying this kind of really maybe rapprochement between the two, or maybe pushing against each other, and therefore, the kind of really implication would this kind of development have on the development of Sunni fiqh?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. On the one hand, it is a really odd thing. And one thing, as I've started working on this project and giving talks on it, was something that people often ask is why is this not a kalam discussion? Why is this even a fiqh discussion in the first place? And, honestly, I'm being guided by the sources that I can find. In other words, I kept on looking in kalam, and it's sort of doesn't really seem to be where the conversation is happening. Yeah, and it is a really odd thing. There's a wonderful moment in Juwayni, in Nihayat al-Matlab, where somebody, it's not even about thawab donation, but someone is there's a whole there's a mas'ala that involves, like who gets the thawab for something. And Juwayni is just like, we're fuqaha. I don't know why we're talking about thawab. Like that, like I don't really talk about otherworldly reward. That's not what I do. And, or at least, in the context of this particular genre, why are we doing this? And so like, on the one hand, all I can say is sort of like, well, it's there. And I think that, there's it's a later text, but I think he's discerning something that is real, that Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, in his Kitab al-Ruh, he discusses thawab donation extensively. And one of the things he says is sort of like, well, if it weren't for the awqaf, we wouldn't be talking about this, right? And, like, I think he really means like, primarily tombs, right? If it weren't that there were awqaf where it's sort of like, because, you really have Shafi'is, some of the Shafi'is who don't believe in this, who are like, yeah, there's no benefit being transferred, like if this doesn't work, then you've got whole, sort of like provisions, like, a lot of these actually were contracts of hire for the reciters, and for a Shafi'i, it's sort of like, well, if there's not any benefit changing hands, like, how is this even valid? So like, I think it becomes a legal issue. It's sort of demand side, that it's sort of like people want to write these, they want to make awqaf that are valid, right? And that means that, basically it's jurists who you have to talk to if you want to make sure that your waqf is it is going to hold up, right? And so like, that would be my hypothesis, right? Of like why it's the jurists who are having this conversation. I don't know.
There is a dimension of, let me put this right because it may strike, some different kind of dimension that I'm not intending. Also there is an element of rationalizing morality in a way that makes sense, not only to the ulama and the rulers and the elite, but also to the common people.
Yes.
They want to do good. You want to close the door or open the door.
Yeah.
There is that kind of feeling that is very striking.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
I wonder, as in relation to this question, but also I was curious when you mentioned worship by proxy in relationship to transferring the law. And maybe, I don't know if any similarity between the two could kind of cause it to be lumped in, but also just curious if that's something that you go into more discussion of in your book, and if you found similar discussions around the two.
Yeah, so doing things by proxy tends to be more directly textually based, right? So, like if people discuss, like, can you do the Hajj by proxy for someone else and what are the parameters of that? Much more of the argumentation is just sort of, well, there's this hadith, right? And this is how we're, and then you get inter-madhab around the edges about, sort of the exact parameters. But people, because it's so textually based, the thing about thawab donation is like, yes, there are hadith, but sort of even proponents are sort of like, yeah, we don't think this hadith. The most explicit hadith texts are the least well authenticated, right? So people don't really have the ability to just say, well, the texts resolve it. We don't have to argue about whether this makes sense, right? Whereas with the proxy performance, most of the time they don't really have to discuss whether it makes sense because it's much more of a, this hadith is good, right? And it's wahi, and so, yeah, like, it doesn't, like, it's an exception to what we would assume would be the rule, that you have to do your own, fulfill your own obligations, but, like, it's textually much clearer. Whereas with the thawab donation, because there's just not that much explicit relevant textual material, they do a lot more discussing of like their presuppositions of why it makes sense or not, But when Ibn Abi Ya'la is sort of like trying, he seems to be the first sort of like textually identifiable person who's like pushing this really hard, and he seems to have to do a lot of argumentation because, you know, like, it sounds like he's debating Shafi'is on this particular point, and that the Shafi'is are sort of incredulous, right? And, you know, he's Hanbali, and so, like, some of it is that, like, he's taking statements of Ibn Hanbal as quite authoritative, but, like, Ibn Hanbal talks about, like, doing a prayer, like salat, and giving it to, like, your parent. And, you know, they're like, really? You know, but it's pretty clear that Ibn Hanbal doesn't think you can fulfill the obligation to pray. So whereas Ibn Hanbal doesn't have this explicit terminology of thawab and gifting thawab, Ibn Abi Ya'la comes and says, yes, it's because doing the action says it such that it's your prayer and it's ascribed to you. That's one thing, and yeah, that's not possible, you know, like, but, you know, he's like, the thawab is a completely separate thing. And, you know, his interlocutor is sort of like, so, you know, you could do an obligatory daily prayer and then gift the merit to your parents and you would have fulfilled the obligation, but you would get no merit. And Ibn Abi Ya'la is like, yeah, what's your problem? You know, and he sort of says, well, you know, like, what if you prayed in, you know, like, there's this sort of mas'ala of the stolen house or the misappropriated house, right? And he's like, well, you know, like, you say that if you pray in a misappropriated house, it could be like, fulfill your obligation and not be meritorious. So, like, why do you have a problem with this, right? But he has to make the argument, so you can tell that not everybody is on board for that. Does that make sense? So, yeah.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I would like to make some parallel between your work and the work of Professor Lena Salayman. She was here last year, and she had an article actually about this topic as well, about zakat, the act of charity giving. Well, she talks about two dimensions of charity giving. One is an act of polity, like
Citizenship. She does
about citizenship.
yeah.
For the divine act and for the polity act. So she separates between these two, but in her case, even non-Muslims are involved in zakat. So I'm curious about like if there are some parallels between this work and yours one. Well, I'm asking like whether if there are some cases where we can clearly see where this merit donation as a political act is more visible than the other one.
That's a great question, and I should revisit that article. I mean, I'm familiar with it, but I hadn't really made a connection with this particular material. So on the one hand, I do think that what she's talking about is a little different in the sense of, you know, this sort of double-edged quality of, you know, being a tax and also being an act of piety, right? I don't think that, like, so when I say that, you know, if I look at one of these documents from Damascus where, say, you can see someone donating the thawab of an umrah to, you know, like to a sultan or to an emir, it's political in my eyes. I'm not sure that it is, that, you know, sort of, there's a label that corresponds to that from the actor's point of view, right? So, I mean, like, I think that there is a sense in which speaking English in the 21st century, I think of gift giving as like a private thing, right? And like when gift giving is involved in political life, we think of it as corruption, right? You know? But definitely sort of that idea is there, like, you know, like you definitely, like, contemporary jurists, if they're like, somebody gives a gift to a qadi and they're like, oh, well, that's very corrupt, right? So it's not that they don't, you know, but they're worried about, like, perversion of judgments, like, oh, you might sway a judge. They don't, I think in terms of gift giving as sort of crossing some kind of conceptual frontier between private and public. Like, as far as I can tell, they just think of gifting as one thing, right? But I would have to think about that more. Like, I think for me as a modern Western English-speaking person, to me it's really salient when somebody, you know, gives a gift to a dignitary that probably they didn't personally know, and that, like, if we try to figure out what their objectives might have been, we're assuming that it's trying to, like, cultivate some kind of patronage relationship or whatever. And, like, to me, that seems very political. I'm not sure where that falls in the categories of the actors in this period, but, like, I think it would be useful to think about the question that you raised more before that's an excellent question. So I can't answer it better than that right now. Thanks.
One last question or comment? Okay, let me ask a question. So, do you deal at all with the Shafa'at Rasul on behalf of the Ummah?
It only comes up in the sense that Shafa'a is a good example for people saying, well, look, if you say that people are only rewarded for their own good works, doesn't that seem like an exception, right? But I'm not directly looking at that. I will say, so it comes up a bit later because people donate merit to the Prophet. And so if you're thinking of that as a relationship of, like, that's the ultimate upward gift, right? It sort of came up when I worked on Mawlids, right? And, you know, like, it's a really common thing historically when people talk about, like, well, what are people doing in Mawlids? Donating the resulting merit to the Prophet is a thing. And when you read sort of debates over, like, well, is that legitimate? Like, some people are sort of like, well, like Ibn Taymiyyah says, you know, like, why would you donate merit to the Prophet, right? You know, does the Prophet need, you know, like, isn't the Prophet exalted over any degree of, like, good work that any ordinary believer could contribute? And, you know, like, the counter argument to that, other than, you know, like, well, God said to bless the Prophet and so forth, but, like, the logical rather than textual argument for that is, you know, well, of course you give gifts to those who are above you because, like, you know, that's the dynamic of gift giving towards those who are above you. You give things that they don't need. It makes no difference to them, but, like, it is the nature of their graciousness that superiors are going to, you know, reciprocate gifts, you know, lavishly, not because they need anything we could offer to them, but because they are so noble.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does,
Yeah.
it does. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, thanks so much, Professor Katz, as well. It was wonderful. Thanks so much for your time, and thanks for coming to ISAM.
Thank you so much.